Hi, good morning, and we're live. Welcome to day 3 of our Vote Local, Get Educated Week of Action. And today we're talking about school boards. And with me, I feel like I've brought a little bit of home to work this morning. I have campaign strategist and former school board member Lisa Longo. And Lisa, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work you're doing.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, it's exciting to be here. Right now, I'm working as a campaign manager on a congressional campaign, but next year we'll be focused on school boards, and I'm always looking for people who are interested in learning about running for school board, because I personally believe it is the most important elected position that we have. Can there be anything more profound than, designing the curriculum and working with educators on how we educate our next future generation of leaders? So that's why I really believe that public education is the foundation of our democracy, and that's where it all starts. One of the things I'm working on now is I'm on the Pennsylvania School Board Association Property Tax Reform Task Force. So working on ideas on how we move to our next level of school funding to fix the problems here in Pennsylvania. I've also been working for a long time with school boards around the nation, just kind of talking to school board members, helping them with policy. And one of the big things I continue to work on is equity. I think every school district needs an equity policy. And one of the things I'm working now and will do after this election is to work with state legislators here in Pennsylvania to actually add equity to the comprehensive plan. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but I'll turn it back to Lisa.
Great. That was a great introduction to the work you're doing now. And if we could rewind just a little bit, I want to go back to a different time and ask you, when it was time to run for school board, why did you choose to run?
I actually decided to run in 2011, and I think it's a funny story. I actually decided to run for office as I was getting arrested at the White House. I know, people are either shocked or thrilled. I was protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. I had been an environmental activist for a number of years, and I'm told that as I was getting arrested, I got this big smile on my face. And it was because I had this realization that I needed to go home and get elected. So I went home in 2011. I started attending first borough council meetings and then school board meetings to kind of see where I belonged. Several people came to me when they heard I was interested in politics and said, "You definitely belong at the school board." The budget is about $100 million. At the time, I think it was like 94, maybe 92 million. But the borough council budget was about 20 million, and that's actually split into two. So their actual budget's like 8 million. But so I started focusing on school board meetings, and I ran in 2013, and I lost that first election because I really didn't know what I was doing. And the day after the election, there was a school board meeting, and I walked into that meeting. And one of the guys on the board came over to me and he said, "What are you doing here? You lost." And I said to him, "Did you think I was going to stay home and cry? Like, I've been coming to these meetings for 2 years. The election wasn't the purpose, like the meeting." So one of the things I always talk about is people just need to attend the meetings.
Right. And it's a really great place to learn a little bit about what happens at the school board level. And there's so many meetings that are held in public that people can sit in on and watch how the meetings play out. And, going back to your election, what did you do to get elected when you went back at it for the second time?
So what I did going into the second time, and I'll tell you that in the second election, I was the top vote getter. So there's a lot I learned in those 2 years. One of the things I did was I wrote op-eds. I would go to these school board meetings. I would take a lot of notes, and I started a blog, and I started a community page where I would share the notes from the meeting. I wouldn't give a lot of opinion in those places, but then I also wrote op-eds, and by its nature, it's an opinion piece where I would give my opinion. I also made sure at school board meetings during public comment, that's televised here in our school district. So I would get up and ask questions, and I pushed the board very hard in several areas where I was, quite concerned. equity being one of them, expenditures being another, because my background is an accountant. So the budget became something I dug very deeply in. The other thing I did was I reached out a lot to people who didn't agree with me and spoke to them. I called a lot of Republicans. I'm a registered Democrat, but I spent a lot of time talking to Republicans and asking them what was their top concern. And I learned a lot from that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it's something that you've brought with you into your other campaign work, right? A lot of reaching across the aisle. And so, when it comes to school boards, what role does political party play?
None. I'm a Democrat. I'm very involved with the Democratic Party, but I leave my party at the door when I walk into that boardroom. Really, party politics, I don't believe, has any role in school board. It's about policy and public policy. Now, having said that, we bring our values into the room. My values are similar to the Democratic Party. That's why I'm a registered Democrat. So it's a tough question, but I can tell you that when I went in, I never brought party politics. And in fact, there's a couple of great videos of debates. One of the things I did as board president was I asked a Republican to serve as my vice president because I wanted to have bipartisan leadership. There were several debates that he and I had where when we walked away from the table, people said, I would have thought Eric was the Democrat and you were the Republican from that 20-minute debate you guys had on taxes or debt or balanced budget. Because in a lot of ways, being an accountant, I brought that to the table.
Yeah, I think that's something, the ability to debate in civilized ways seems to be lost when we start to look at all the national media and the noise around this campaign. But, I've seen some local elections that had similar ties to party and that got a little nasty. So it's interesting to me to see candidates reach out to both parties and cross-register so that, especially in the primary elections, they're on both ballots. And they're supported and endorsed by both parties. They're always the most interesting school board members to me.
I will tell you that I cross-filed, although I did not survive either time to get on the Republican ballot through the primary. So I did run only as a Democrat, although I would have been happy to run, on both. I think it's an interesting thing in Pennsylvania politics that school boards and judges run, nonpartisan by running bipartisan. You're literally running on both tickets. It's kind of weird.
Right. It's strange. It is. But, I think when it comes right down to it and the work of the board, from what I've seen in school board meetings, party really doesn't play a role absent, like you said, your value structure and the things that you believe are good for communities and kids. So while you were voting, you've talked about being in the school board meetings and writing op-eds. Were there any other ways that you communicated with voters to get your message out and to let them know how much you cared about the local school?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a big fan of community events, so I go to all of them. I love our school plays and concerts. I'm often out at, when we could have First Friday and those kinds of events. Now, of course, that's all going to be different, but I would often be in the community and people would come up to me. They would recognize me from watching the school board meetings. And I remember one woman who works at our local pharmacy who would say, I just love watching school board meetings when you're there because you make it so much more interesting. You explain things really well. I'm a huge fan of transparency. So I would actually, when I was board president, insist that we have that civil discourse and that debate about issues, that we not just have a quick vote. Even when I knew there was going to be a majority voting a certain way, I wanted to make sure voters, constituents understood what we were voting on and why. So I think that was a big thing, just accessibility. Giving out my phone number. People thought that was crazy. I was one of the first people, way back in 2013, I would give people my real cell phone number and say, please feel free to call me. Let's have coffee. And one man actually had asked me if I would promise never to raise taxes. I said, no. I said, I won't. I said, I'm actually going to promise you that I will absolutely have to raise your taxes. And we ended up having a great conversation. And I don't know if he actually voted for me or not, but he said he really appreciated me taking the time. So that accessibility, that willingness to defend your position, to be honest with voters, I don't pander. I won't do that. I'm not going to say something just because it's easy or popular. I'm going to do what is best.
And I think that's so important. One of the things that we had mentioned this morning in our action and our email was that, you should reach out to the community members that are running for school board, and they will want to talk to you. And a lot of voters don't feel like they have that accessibility. So to hear it from somebody who's been in that position and willing to talk to people, I think it will go a long way for helping people go ahead and take that step and reach out, call, or somehow communicate, send an email, send a note to those folks that are running when they have questions and they want to learn a little bit more about where they stand. So when you were elected, finally, you told us a little bit in a couple ways about what it was like to be a board member. But if I were going to run and I wanted to know from you what I could expect as being a school board member, what's the job like?
I can speak to Pennsylvania. I want to be clear. I'm not really aware if all school boards operate similarly, but I do know ours. So in our school board, we have a monthly workshop meeting and a voting meeting, and then you have your committee meetings. All of those are public meetings here in Pennsylvania, or at least here in Southeast PA where I live. Each board member is assigned, again, there's 9 board members here, so each board member was assigned 2 committees. The board president acts as an ex officio member of all the committee structure. So we here in Phoenixville have finance, building and grounds, personnel, policy. I feel like I'm always missing one. But those are the ones I can think of. And so when I first was elected, the school board president at the time came to me and he said, where would you like to go? And I said, I've been attending finance meetings and curriculum meetings because before I was elected, that was my big 2 concerns. I said, but I feel like I'm really weak on policy and building and grounds. And I'd like to learn more. So I'd like to go to those committees. And he said, I'm so happy to hear you say that because I like to put people where they're weak, not strong. And he knew I was going to keep going to the finance and curriculum meetings because I'd been going for 2 years, or actually I'd been going for 4 years at that time. So I started out, and what you find out quickly on policy is that is really the, most important committee, in my opinion. Because that's where it all starts. And one of the policies I'm most proud that we changed was our dress code. Phoenixville's dress code still had that archaic language in it, common decency. And I said, who's the arbiter? Who decides what's commonly decent? Why are you policing girls' clothing and not boys? So we pulled to that policy, we ripped it to shreds, we rewrote it, we brought it back. Girls can wear tank tops now in Phoenixville.
That's amazing.
Right?
There's
it's amazing
so
to me that they couldn't. Boys could wear tank tops, but girls couldn't. So we changed that. There's a lot of work we need to do on these things. But if you start reading your school board policies, you're going to quickly see that just changing a word or 2 can have a profound impact.
Right. And that's something that's been in need of tweaking in many districts for a long time.
Absolutely.
But it's not something that rises to the top of the pile until there's a problem.
Right.
So, we don't really take a look regularly.
Right. And that's the thing with what is the job? That was your question. So for me, I'm lucky to be self-employed. So the first week of every month, when I knew my committee meetings were coming, I would spend about 10 to 15 hours reading the agendas, researching the items on there. The second week, we would have finance, which was pulled out as a separate meeting because it was often so long, and our workshop meeting. So then we would have had our committee meetings. So I would then be writing responses to objections or, my position, whether it be pro or con on an issue that was coming up for vote. So then maybe, 5 to 7 hours. That third week we had our voting meeting. I would maybe put in another 5 hours. If I had calls to make, I would often call other board members, speak to them about their positions, speak to constituents, answer emails that had come in. This was when I was board president. Certainly less time is spent as a member than when you're the board president. But I always tell people to schedule, plan on about 20 hours a month if you really want to do a thorough job.
Right. Yeah. And I've heard that figure or relatively similar figure from a lot of different places. So it seems like a really accurate summary of the work that board members are doing. And it's a volunteer position as well. So you're doing that work unpaid, just for the good of kids, schools, communities, and, people care. And that's why they're there.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's the only totally unpaid elected position. Municipal positions, my understanding is they get some kind of a stipend. I don't know. I don't think it's much. I think it's, like maybe $100 a month, I've heard. I'm not sure. But school board is, as far as I know, the only totally unpaid elected position. And again, as school board president, I actually spent well more than 20 hours. I was either on the phone or in our district office almost every day for that year I was school board president.
Wow. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of commitment to be there that long. So you mentioned the dress code. What are some other examples of decisions or, maybe some kind of big district, renovations or other events that took place that you were a part of making those decisions?
I'm so glad you mentioned renovations because you and I have talked about this. Starting as an environmental activist, one of the first things I was concerned with was the sustainability of our buildings. And we worked for years. We switched to biodegradable cleaning products, for example, more earth-friendly products. But one of the biggest things I'm most proud of, and we started before I was elected, by the way, we were building 2 new schools in Phoenixville. Mm-hmm. And I happened to be at a building and grounds meeting and overheard someone say, well, now that we're not going to do geothermal. And I went, excuse me, why aren't we doing geothermal? And they said, oh, well, it's too expensive. The next 18 months of my life were spent proving that it was not more expensive and that, in fact, it would save taxpayers money. Mm. We went on to build those 2 schools with geothermal and other simple things like lots of natural lights. So we save on both heating and electricity and other areas like filtered water. But there was just a lot of thoughtfulness that went into the design, which ended up saving taxpayers money. We save on energy costs $70,000 a year because of the geothermal. And that's in just 2 buildings. So right. Imagine if we could do this on a national scale, which is one of the things I hope, after this election, to start working with candidates for school board and elected officials already on school board to talk to them about retrofitting their buildings and how do we go in and, remodel schools. COVID is another instance. I've been writing for some national policy think tanks and things about what do we need to do for COVID. Some simple things, some simple remodeling. One of the biggest things I've seen no one talking about it yet is bathroom use. We need to limit the same groups of students to the same group bathrooms during the day in case someone tests positive, so you would have that contact tracing available. I brought that up in a meeting like 3 weeks ago with the NIH and the CDC, and they were both like, wow, that's not something we had in our. So that's something that hopefully gets into the guidelines. Also, mandatory scheduled hand washing. So we need sinks. Every kindergarten through, I believe, 2nd grade needs to have a sink either in the classroom or right outside the classroom, because we need children to be washing their hands. Again, I say every hour at that age because we know how kids are. But in older grades too, we need to have more sinks available. This is what's going to help. So remodeling in our schools is going to be a huge issue for the next year because, look, COVID will hopefully, by spring, we'll start to have some answers. But I don't believe this is going to be the only virus that's going to impact us. So I think smart planning has to take place now so that the next time we're faced with something like this, we're better prepared.
Right. And, Speaking of COVID, I've heard a lot of people say that school boards have been critical during this pandemic. Why is that the case? What are some things that school boards have been doing and that communities have been counting on them to do to keep their kids safe when they're going back to school?
Yeah, the first and best thing that school boards were able to do with the help of Governor Wolf and the Pennsylvania Department of Education was they put the money to continue feeding children.
Mm,
So people do not realize just how many families rely on their local schools for breakfast and lunch. So that program was started almost immediately. I was very happy to see that. The second thing now, when we went into online school and virtual school, we were able to see that school boards were making decisions with regard to technology. How do we make sure every child had a laptop? In the beginning, this was really difficult. We know that we saw the reports, Philadelphia, where they didn't have the money to get technology to students. You know, that
mm,
was a huge issue. In rural Pennsylvania, where we don't have good, stable internet access, we had to deal with that issue. School boards were the front line of this. The problem was they didn't have the funding, they still don't, but they did the best they could. I've seen examples of school boards just going above and beyond, figuring out how to get that technology need met. The next thing, and now what they're doing, is looking at how we put students back in buildings. Again, this is my personal opinion. I don't think we should have kids in buildings right now. Most school boards I know are still meeting virtually. And if you're meeting virtually, you have no business asking staff or students to be back in buildings. But that's a personal opinion. So I see kids going back to school, and I'm worried because the CDC guidelines are really clear. You had to upgrade your
mm.
HVAC to a MERVS 13. I only know one or two districts that have done that. You need windows that open. You need this hand washing. You need outside time. You need to rotate students. You need to have the 6 foot perimeter around students. I don't know that any of that was possible, and I don't think it's fair to ask staff
Mm.
and faculty to be responsible until we've done all that. On the other hand, we now know how many parents rely on school as a form of daycare. We
Right.
also know now that the economy is based upon us having students in school so parents can work. So there's a much bigger problem that we all need to be talking about, and that's safe, affordable childcare. It's safe, reliable internet. It's safe technology for our students.
Mhm.
Buildings aren't the only answer, right? So with COVID,
Right.
school boards are basically trying to grapple with a national devastating pandemic. And some of them are doing a really great job of it, but most of them are struggling to understand. So one of the white papers I've been working on writing is about that hierarchy of the guidelines of what happens at the CDC, the state, the county, and the local, that we will
Mhm.
be able to provide to school boards, and we'll be able to give them some training so that they can understand what it is they're supposed to do.
Yeah, and I know, right, when we were making those decisions to go back to school, that we had in my area anyway, which is also a pretty rural part of Pennsylvania. I sat in on a few school board meetings and listened to the conversations that they were having. And you're absolutely right. They talked about doing what they could. Technology wise, when kids first were pulled out of school in March, and also providing for food for kids who were experiencing food scarcity. But then when it came time to go back, there was some heated debate about whether or not they should be going back all virtually or in person. And many of the districts here went back in person in some form. And they are balancing the safety of kids and what their buildings and their buses, what capacity they have to keep kids socially distanced, with that reality of parents really needing an option for their kids in order to get to work. And they were very thoughtful about those conversations. But we're also hearing that a lot of opinion articles out there and some research studies from other countries where schools, they're hearing that guidance that schools maybe are not super spreader places and that kids are relatively safe in school. Having said that, I read an article this morning that puts Schuylkill County as one of the 5 counties in Pennsylvania that's had a substantial increase in COVID cases, and the guidance now coming down is for those schools to buckle it back up and send the kids home to do all virtual again. Um, School boards, I can see them in my community being a really critical piece of this puzzle. On Friday, there are school board presidents heading into a meeting to find out, what the numbers really are, and to make a decision about whether or not they're pulling all those kids back out of school, and that's really important. Just as a school board member, what would be going through your mind if you were back there? Now you've sent all the kids back to school. Now you've got to pull them back out.
Yeah, I think, looking at your community numbers, that's why this is so confusing. I had a call last night about school boards and local authority. The best thing about our school functioning, the way we function, our public education system, is that it's local, so that every school district can make decisions. So we shouldn't be imposing a blanket rule. I can't decide if every school can reopen. What we can decide is where there's low enough numbers, where we're not worried about a super spreader event. Yeah, sure, those kids can come back in. But, just like we see with things as simple as strep throat, where you can be a carrier, we're not worried about maybe the children getting as sick as we are about them bringing it home to a parent who's undergoing cancer treatment or who has an underlying condition. And that's the kind of transmission issue as opposed to the super spreader issue. So there's kind of two different issues there. But what would go through my mind if I had to lock down schools again and send children home is, how do we do this better next time? One of my first concerns from the very beginning was building integrity. How do we make sure buildings are safe to put anyone back in? Faculty, staff, students, volunteers, if that's allowed. How do we do this 6-foot thing? Well, ends up it's pretty simple. If the classroom is 100 square feet, you can use math, basic algebra, to figure out how many students can be in that room. Those are the kinds of considerations, and I think a lot of school districts didn't take the time to say we need to follow all of these rules. They kind of picked and choose which ones were easy. And now we're going to go into winter when it's going to be even harder because we're not going to be able to be outside as often. So I think you're going to have even fewer children at school. Whereas when it's nice weather, you can rotate students in and out of classrooms between, right?
Right.
So we're going to need more janitorial staff. We're going to need more nurses. And I believe we're going to need more teachers because I think we're going to have smaller class sizes. And look, this is actually a good thing for the economy, right? If you want to talk about our economy is right now going into a big recession, how do you get out of a recession? You create jobs. So this creates jobs. School districts are often the largest employers.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at that, the question is, how do we fund it, right? That's what I am now working on. I'm writing something on that. We can fund this. We know how to do these things because when you create jobs in your community and that puts more money, local businesses will benefit. And that's the middle class was created based upon municipal and school district jobs. So what I'm saying now is we can have a return to that. So if we want kids in buildings, guess what? You're going to need more janitors, you're going to need more nurses, and you're going to need more teachers. And that's what I would be advocating for if I were on any board right now. I'm advocating it even though I'm not on a board.
Wow. Yeah, that all makes sense. To follow those guidelines, we need more people there to, to do those jobs, to spread the kids out. And I think benefits in the long term for having those additional staff members in districts. So I often hear you say or see you write about electing, like it's really imperative that we elect good school board members or we find good people to run for school board. What does that mean?
In my opinion, again, I'm looking for people who are thoroughly committed to public education. I think the foundation of our democracy is our free public education system. And it has been decimated by allowing outsourcing and privatization and chipping away, larger class sizes, taking away benefits, reducing staff. All of these things have harmed our public schools. Standardized testing. So when we talk about failing public schools, basing them on these arbitrary kind of testing scores, I look at that and I just think that's just wrong. And when I started to look at the why on the how we got here, it ends up that a lot of that is controlled by school boards. So when I look for a good school board member, the first thing I want is somebody who's going to start going to the meetings right away. You've got to understand the process. You can't just show up on election day and go, yeah, here I am. You have to have an understanding to talk to voters. A good school board member is open-minded, enjoys doing research, works well with others, and is going to have the ability to understand public policy and public budgeting. And that's a lot to ask of a volunteer. But those are the people who I think make the best school board members. If you're running for school board with a personal agenda, if you're coming because you want to destroy public schools, because you don't like property taxes, because you think teachers are paid too much, those are not good reasons to run for public office. And we actually had somebody like that run for school board, and he ended up resigning from Phoenixville because when he got there, he realized that you're one of 9. You've got to work as a team, and those personal agenda items, look, and that's not to say I didn't bring some ideas that I personally wanted. My big one was I wanted free summer school. I think we need that for our students to solve the achievement gap. Every year I tried to get it into the budget. Every year I ended up pulling it because there were other items that were a bigger priority. So, and my colleagues would come to me and they would say, I really respect that you'll pull that item because you knew you didn't have the votes, and I'm not going to have a floor fight on something I'm going to lose. I would rather focus on something that we as a team could all agree on. And that's what you have to be willing to do. You have to be willing to set aside your personal, wish list for the good of the students. The other thing that I think makes a good school board member is I always walked into that room and I said the first thing I would ask is, how does this impact my students? The second question is, how does it impact my faculty and staff? The third question is, how does it impact my community and taxpayers? And that was my priority list. If the first question, if this was going to negatively impact students, I did not need to go any further. It wasn't going to happen. Because a good school board member, you are there for the students first.
Right. And that's, what, as you were talking here, I was thinking to myself, I want somebody there who's going to focus primarily and first and foremost on student achievement and achievement for all kids, equity across the board. And that has to be the first question. It has to be, how are the kids in this district doing? Are they achieving? And that, they come first. Kids come first. So that has to be number one. And then, like you said, the other priorities kind of follow. And so here's the tough question around election time is, firstly, if I'm looking at a candidate, what do I need to know about those school board members, if anything more than we just talked about? What am I looking for? What do I need to know? What questions do I need to ask?
Yeah, I mean, the first question I would always ask is, have you been attending the meetings? What is going on currently in the school board? What do you personally bring to the table? The second question I'm going to ask someone is, how do you feel about public education? Where do you stand on vouchers, for example? Where do you stand on school choice? Where do you stand on, curriculum? Where do you stand on standardized testing? These are big ideological, pedagogical questions that you need to know from your school board members. The second set of questions, is going to be, I would always ask someone, where do you fall on taxes? Are you going to be a never tax person? Because to me, that the minute I say I'm never going to raise taxes, I know you're going to have to cut something in the future. Because the cost of everything goes up. The cost of insurance goes up. The cost of energy goes up. The cost of supplies goes up. And if I have an increase and I can't raise taxes to do it, that means I'm cutting something. And most often it's going to be the arts, it's going to be teachers, it's going to be librarians. And those are not things I'm willing to cut. So, library funding is something that, we need to talk about in our public schools because it's the first place people have been cutting. And if you look at the statistics, which my high school librarian brought to the school board on, student success, when you have a good library and good librarians, there's definitely a connection there. So we have to look at things like that and recognize that sometimes these cuts, they're part of the reason public schools are quote unquote family.
Mm-hmm. Right. So school board elections, they're not happening in every state right now. I think just about half of the country will be seeing school board members on their ballots on November 3rd. So they're all the way down at the bottom. And unfortunately, usually an afterthought for a lot of people when it comes to elections. So how do I, as a voter, go about finding information? It's not as easy as finding out about your presidential candidates or your congressional candidates. How do I go out now in this lead up to the next election to find out what I need to know about the people running for my school board?
So a candidate should, at the very minimum, have a Facebook page or a website that you can find information on them. They have to file paperwork, so you can find a list of candidates through your county voter or election services. Sometimes school districts will have information on candidates. I don't think it's a good idea for them to post information. But I do know, someone once told me, oh, well, our school district posted. I think that makes it a little too political, but that, again, personal opinion, fine if you do decide to do it. But county election services would have that. Your local Democratic and Republican parties may or may not have information. Some don't get involved with school board here in Pennsylvania because they're quote unquote bipartisan. But at the very least, you should be able to get who's running and then find contact information and reach out for that person either via their website or social media. Hopefully they'll have an event where you could talk to them, a forum where you could ask questions. I know, again, here in Chester County, we always had a school board candidate forum where we gave voters the opportunity to come and question candidates.
That's great.
Yeah, so you need to be willing to answer questions and face voters.
Great. And it's not something, the forums and things like that are not something that I see frequently where school board members are coming out. That usually rises up a little bit on the ballot for people who are coming out and interacting with people. A lot of times there isn't a whole lot of information to have. So to go out there and searching, which is, of course, researching is what we're recommending to everybody to do before you vote somebody onto that very important place. But let's look at it conversely now. If I'm a candidate, outside of Facebook, outside of a web page, or outside of, trying to be invited to a candidates forum, is there any other way that I can get my message out to voters so that they know I'm a good candidate?
Right now with COVID, social media is definitely the best way. Making calls is second best way right now. I'm not recommending that anyone go door to door. Writing a letter to the editor of your local newspaper, maybe trying to get a radio interview somewhere. I think, if anybody's listening who has a local TV or radio, inviting school board candidates to answer questions is imperative. Democracy functions best with full transparency and inclusion. And school boards control a lot locally. Often the biggest tax we pay here in Pennsylvania is our property taxes. Again, the largest employer, largest purchaser of energy, largest purchaser of supplies. That impacts prices in the market. People want to talk about market forces. Well, guess what? Your local school district is a major player in market forces. Wages. You want to talk about why wages are stagnant? Well, substitute teachers used to make $22 to $25 an hour, and through some questionable practices, that's gone down to $14 or $15 an hour. It's something I've exposed and put out there. So if you can only make $14 to $15 an hour as a degreed teacher, because most substitutes now you have to be a degreed teacher, right? Well, That's kind of ridiculous. That's insulting in my mind. And that's what allows places like McDonald's and Walmart to get away with paying $10 or $12 an hour because you can't get a better salary. It used to be your local school district set the standard. If somebody could come in and make $20 or $25 an hour, that forces wages for everybody to go up. So that was part of the whole privatization and outsourcing scam, in my opinion. Again, I always have to say in my opinion, because I know there are a lot of people who are going to disagree with me here. But, when we started to decimate that, if you look at municipal jobs and specifically school district jobs, we've probably lost 30% of the jobs we had just 15 years ago in school districts. That's the middle class. That's who had those jobs. And they did it by convincing people that these jobs were overpaid. Well, if you look at our system now, good jobs with healthcare and pensions are what kept our economy stable. Now, when you take away pensions and healthcare, that's why Social Security and Medicare are being strained because we've lost these good middle-class jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where I come down on, again, on the economy. If we want to rebuild our economy easily, quickly, we're going to look to our school districts, our local school boards, and I hate to put this on school board elected officials because I know this is bigger than them. So now I'm asking them to be an economist as well as everything else. But really, we need to help our school board members understand public policy and economic policy and how this impacts all of us. And this is why I'm actually advocating for a national task force, and then each state would have a task force that we would develop these plans to give to our school districts to help them to move toward, hiring more and returning us to a stable economy and community.
Right. So I think from all of this that we talked about is what's really clear is that school board elections are far more important than we usually give them credit for. And if I had to convince somebody in maybe 3 points, why should you care about who's running for school board and your school board elections? If I asked you that question in just 3 points, what would you tell me?
The first point is because children are our most important and treasured asset. There's nothing more important than safeguarding our children and their future, and that's what schools do. The second point would be because children are our most treasured and important asset. I mean, I can't say that strongly enough. I believe that. I got into politics because of my daughter, because of my friends' children. And then the third point would be because school districts do impact your life much more than you realize, from how much property tax you pay to the wages in your community. They have a huge impact. So those would be the 3 things. And I know 2 of them are the same, but sorry. That's how
That's okay. That's okay. All right, great. I think that's a really great place to wrap for today. So I want to thank you for joining me here during our Get Educated Week of Action and spending your time with us today. I know you're very busy working on campaigns. So, we very much appreciate you lending us an hour of your time. And I think that's about it. Do you have any parting words for our guests?
Just if you've ever thought about running, please do. One of the things I know is that women especially need to be asked 7 times before they will agree to run for office. Yep. So consider this, you're all being asked to run for office. And I'm happy to speak to anyone who's considering it. I'm happy to help you. I'm part of Emily's List has a Facebook group where we mentor other women who are thinking of running. So if anyone's thinking of running, please reach out. I do have a professional page, Lisa Longo, consultant and strategist. You can reach out to me there or through Lisa, and I would love to help you run for school board.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for that. And I will let you get back to work today. And thanks again for being here and for helping us understand how important our school boards are.
Great. Thank you.